Just 4 decades ago, over 90% of China's population lived in severe poverty. Today, it stands as the second largest economy on Earth. In 1978, the country accounted for a mere 2% of global GDP. Now, that figure exceeds 18%. This economic explosion emerged from the wreckage of deep historical trauma. After suffering through a long century of humiliation under foreign powers and losing roughly 30 million lives during World War II, the nation was left in ruins. Out of that post-war chaos, a violent civil war concluded in 1949, with the Communist Party seizing control and declaring the People's Republic of China. At the top of this new state sat Mao Zedong, the absolute ruler and architect of a rigidly centralized communist system. He held total authority, and without any democratic checks or balances to temper his decisions, the stage was set for a massive, unchecked experiment in dictatorial control. In 1958, Mao launched the Great Leap Forward. His goal was to instantly modernize agriculture and industry by forcing all private land and resources into strict government ownership. Citizens were ordered to construct small-scale backyard steel furnaces to boost production. Instead of industrializing, the campaign consumed vital resources to produce worthless metal. Meanwhile, the agricultural sector collapsed. With the state confiscating all land and taking the entire harvest, farmers had zero incentive to grow crops, causing food production to plummet. Then came the disastrous sparrow extermination campaign. Mao ordered the killing of millions of birds to protect grain, which instead caused insect populations to explode, devouring what little crops remained. These consecutive policy failures triggered a massive man-made famine. Between 20 and 40 million people starved to death in just a few years. Facing internal criticism for the disaster, Mao refused to admit fault. He launched the Cultural Revolution in 1966, utilizing civilian armies to violently purge his critics and consolidate his grip on power. By the time Mao died in 1976, up to 50 million lives had been lost. His legacy proved that when an entire economy is bound to the untested impulses of one man, the result is starvation. Into the ensuing power vacuum stepped Deng Xiaoping. He inherited a completely shattered and impoverished nation. Having been targeted by Mao's purges himself, Deng held a drastically different view on how to govern. He recognized that rigid state control was suffocating the population, and he introduced policies for immediate economic liberalization. His first major reform was the household responsibility system. Rather than government communes, individual farming families were given long-term leases on land and the freedom to decide exactly what they wanted to plant. The genius of the policy was its built-in incentive. Farmers still had to meet a strict government quota, but they were allowed to sell any excess produce on the open market and keep the cash. Soon, Deng applied this exact same logic of decentralization to the manufacturing sector with the factory manager responsibility system. Political interference was removed from the factory floor. Workers and managers were given the authority to set their own production targets, price their goods, and retain the profits they generated. Between the late 1970s and mid-1980s, grain production doubled. By replacing dictatorial mandates with grassroots incentives, the government proved that citizens will naturally innovate when they are allowed to own their success. But Deng knew raw labor wouldn't be enough to modernize the country. He mandated a massive push for human capital, introducing a 9-year compulsory education law and directing heavy funding into science, technology, and engineering. With a newly educated rural workforce, local communities began establishing grassroots companies known as Township and Village Enterprises, or TVEs. These local businesses rapidly expanded into manufacturing and technology, eventually birthing global titans like Huawei, and generated roughly 100 million jobs that helped bridge the rural-urban wealth gap. By 1980, the country was ready for the next phase of liberalization, opening its doors to the outside world through special economic zones. These zones offered extreme tax breaks, slashed bureaucratic red tape, and an open environment to attract massive foreign capital. Multinational corporations like Apple, Nike, and Volkswagen flooded in. China offered them an incredibly potent combination: a massive labor pool that was cheap, but already highly skilled and experienced. Deng described his philosophy as crossing the river by feeling the stones. By sequentially educating the workforce and building local enterprise first, China constructed a foundation robust enough to absorb global capitalism. The physical result of these policies was staggering. Modest fishing villages like Shenzhen exploded into high-tech, trillion-dollar megacities almost overnight. This chart shows China and India's annual GDP per capita since 1990. Initially, they shared an identical low baseline, but as Deng's reforms took effect, China's wealth rockets upward, reaching over 3 times India's trajectory by 2020. Yet, behind this chart lies a brutal paradox. Deng granted his citizens incredible economic liberty, while ruthlessly denying them political freedom. When citizens demanded democracy in 1989, the state responded with the Tiananmen Square massacre, proving the military would be used to crush political opposition. China secured its status as a global superpower through a very specific compromise: total economic pragmatism securely chained to an unyielding authoritarian regime. Because Deng never dismantled the one-party state, the underlying mechanism for absolute dictatorship was left completely intact. Today, under the leadership of Xi Jinping, the country is actively rolling back Deng's decentralized approach in favor of strict one-man control. We saw echoes of Mao's era during the 2020 pandemic, where extreme top-down lockdowns overrode practical realities and severely restricted personal liberties. It serves as a stark reminder. No matter how much wealth is generated, any nation's progress is fragile when there are no democratic checks and balances to restrain a leader's unchecked will. Pragmatic economic reforms saved China from starvation and built a modern superpower. But without political freedom, the dictator's shadow still dictates its future.